What are your talents? What are you naturally good at? Now, it doesn't mean you're good at them. We will see some people, they are naturally gifted in an area. And I think this is what you alluded to. You still have to develop that talent. Hey, good day. Welcome to the Consultant of the Coach podcast. I'm here with my good buddy Josh. How are you, my friend?
Good. How are you doing today?
Awesome. We're of course coming off a very amazing weekend. Our kids had a great track meet, and things are on the upside.
And summer's coming, and here we go.
Right on. So, hey, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so today we're talking about a topic that comes up actually in my work a lot more often than I ever realized it would, but something called StrengthsFinder. Many of you probably have done this. This book's been out for years and years now.
Yeah, a long time. It's CliftonStrengthsFinder.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting work that was done. My understanding of it is basically the idea originally was this idea that, instead of worrying about your weaknesses and trying to cover those up, which is important, more importantly, try to work on enhancing your strengths if you understand what those are. And I find that this is a helpful language for trying to understand myself, but also working with other key leaders, in the strategy consulting work that I do. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. What do you think about it? What do you know about it?
I've been looking at it for 2 to 3 years. I've done the original reports. I've been working with a lot of coaches and consultants who are really big into StrengthsFinders, who are authorized StrengthsFinders, whatever that's called. I'm not, but I've hung out with a lot of them, and they swear by it. A lot of organizations use it, and it really is. I love the 34 strengths that are out there. But hey, before we jump into it, what Bible verse did you come up with?
Yeah, I think a couple verses come to mind that sort of fence around this a little bit. 1 Corinthians 12 talks a lot about spiritual gifts. So obviously there's these are different than spiritual gifts, of course, but I think there's this understanding that people are made uniquely with different makeup, right? And then Psalm 139 comes to mind, fearfully and wonderfully made. Again, people are made with differences, right? There's diversity in people, in humanity, and I think as a group we are designed to reflect the image of God, and that includes, I think, these area of strengths, understanding where we are at our best, where's God designed us to be good, and also I think in humility, recognizing where we have need of each other, because we can't, we don't have all the strengths. Right. We don't. We have deficiencies, and so surrounding ourselves with people, especially as leaders, with other strengths intentionally is important. So understanding who we are, but then finding other people who can complement us.
And what I was even reflecting last week, not on StrengthsFinder, but basically how God has made us so diverse. If He has made us for community. He made us for community because we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and so He wants us to work together. If He wanted us to be solopreneurs, He would give us everything that we needed right out. It'd be an all-in-one, and we're not built that way.
Right. No, and business isn't that way, right? Business is a community of people and organizations and industries. I mean, these are all community terms that they're core. These are core social elements, right, to building companies and revenue and profit and things like that.
Yeah. So we're first.
We're first. Well, I could tell you a funny story actually about StrengthsFinder. I was thinking about this. Maybe you can share one too. I think one of the things about StrengthsFinder I always like to laugh at myself about is we have strengths, but in the wrong scenarios, these strengths are also weaknesses.
Yes,
so
they can be.
Any strength is a weakness. And so actually one funny story I'll share about that. One of my number one strength is responsibility, which plays out good and bad, right? So it's sort of, plays out probably a little too independent, probably a little bit too self-minded and assured at times. But one of these things recently played out with a client because we have had trouble with this client. So this client I've been working with for, almost a year on a significant technology installation for the organization, serving some really important social and public health needs for a large county, with a lot of Medicaid dollars and things like that to go behind this key resource is going to help connect and more efficiently, make use of a lot of important resources in the community. And we've been having trouble getting full alignment with another part of the organization. Right? Okay. This has been pretty well-known challenge. And coming out of a meeting, a person from this other group basically committed verbally to doing some work. And so then I sent an email about a week later, and someone asked me, did you specifically say in your email that this is this other person, I won't name them, this other person's responsibility? And I looked at it, and I hadn't. And I had this realization about myself is I am such an over-the-top responsibility person that if you address a topic in an email to me of any kind, I will likely just take that hint and go do the work. Mm-hmm. Like I don't even flinch. Like, of course I have work. Like it's a responsibility of mine. Of course I get it done. And the weakness is I then communicate in the same way, and I am not as directive as I need to be for people who are not responsibility driven, which is most people. Mm-hmm. And I had referenced everything about it. It was very clear to me, like in the communication, that it was their responsibility, but I hadn't actually said the words, this is person X's responsibility, right? For the audience in the email.
So what happened?
Well, actually, the work hasn't gotten done yet. but we have rounded back and since recommunicated with greater clarity. The work still hasn't gotten done because of the fact that there's a lot of contributing factors to the scenario I won't get into. But it was this interesting aha of even just a week ago in the random, kind of movements of my work, recognizing my own StrengthsFinder kind of recognition, and had this aha moment of where a StrengthsFinder can be a weakness because of the fact that I forget that other people are not as responsible as I am. And that's not to say I'm better. It's just my number one strength is responsibility, and it's not for most people. And so they do not take the hint as well as I typically do. Because if you leave an open-ended question to me, I'll be like, sweet, and I'm going to run and answer 10 other questions because that's my job, right?
And you're going to find 10 other ways of making money from it. You're amazing.
Give
you one thing and off you go.
I'm like a dog, man. You just send me in the right direction. but I had this, it was this funny use of StrengthsFinder, like I said, in the last week, that not all the people are that way. So I think as we talk about StrengthsFinders, and if those of you who have done it, or if you will, out of this podcast, I would recommend think carefully about how those show up, and think carefully about how those show up in ways that are actually weaknesses, right? To your work, like blinders, ISIS blinders, right? So you would assume, oh yeah, of course I would be this way, right? A learner, right? And not everybody's a learner, an ideator, not everybody's a learner. I'm just looking at your list over there, but
So for example, if anyone just walking into StrengthsFinder, there's Gallup came up with this list of 34 strengths. Everyone has, you're really high on typically 5, and then you're also really low on 5. And I think it's, I'll put the link in the podcast. I think it's like $40. They'll give you exactly where you score on all 34. Mm-hmm. Well, you need to know your bottom 5 because those will sometimes take you out. Well, you know what you're really, really good at. So, for example, my top 5, my number 1 is command, number 2, activator, number 3, ideation, number 4, learner, and number 5, intellection. And those would be my top 5. Everyone is a little bit different. But where it is I think back to, this is before I had known StrengthsFinder. I had a fellow come work for me, and he's really an interesting fellow. That's all I can really say is if you saw him, you'd say, wow, he's interesting. But his strengths were off the chart. And I looked at his previous resume, and the guy had been fired like 3 times. So you're like, well, Erik, why do you take a flyer on him? I was able to figure out exactly why he was fired all 3 times. Mm-hmm. So when he came to work for my organization, I'm like, well, those 3 things you are not doing. I put really good boundaries around him. He was not a manager. He was not a leader, but he did some other things really, really well. And the fascinating thing was once we gave him really good boundaries, kept him out of his weakness, he knocked it out of the park. Absolutely out of the park. Now you might say, well, how did it end? He was doing so well, he got cocky, left our organization to do everything for someone else, and didn't even last a year before he was fired again.
Got it.
And I use that as an example because here was someone, we understand how to use strengths, and we're able to take someone with a lot of weaknesses, and he knocked it out of the park. Likewise, if you're not aware of your weaknesses, you're just going to go drive off a cliff, and that's what he did at his next job. So it's really helpful to understand what are strengths, what are weaknesses. Yeah.
Well, and you made me think of, and as you as a coach, I think will appreciate this, the way you describe that. I think a lot of different sports and players who you find who are dysfunctional in certain systems, right? And there's always that coach who's willing to take a flyer on a player, not because they don't have problems, but because you think maybe I can make them work in my system, right? And then inevitably going on from there, you see a player who does fit. Then they get cocky, they chase the free agent contract, and then they just flame out somewhere else because it was the system that knew how to leverage specifically their strengths, and like what you said, put up some boundaries to guard them from their weaknesses, right? And I think that's very true for team players on any. Not every team player, because some people are less volatile, right? They have less ups and less downs, and maybe a lower ceiling, but a higher floor.
Well, correct me. You're the baseball guy, but in baseball, there's the 5-tool player. Everyone wants a 5-tool player, but there's not many of them that go around.
No, well, and it's also how do you guard from you might have someone who's great at hitting, but then you're miserable in the field, right? So if they happen to get to decent enough to get to the pros, you make them your designated hitter before too long because they're a liability in the field, but their bat is so strong. And likewise, you've got some players who are decent in everything but not great at any one thing, and so they become your utility players versus your starters, and so on and so on and so on. So but it's true for I'm sure it's true for running, and it's true for football and baseball and basketball, soccer. I mean, any of these sports, but it applies to the business as well.
And so I'll give you an example of one of my fellows on my team right now. I actually just had him take the StrengthsFinder, the fully paid StrengthsFinder last week. And it was really fascinating. His top 5 were exactly what I thought they were. This guy is amazing. His top 5 was input, strategic, ideation, intellection, and developer. So you would look at all those things. This guy's a rock star. But I also looked at his bottom 5. And this was fascinating. So this is what he's not good at. And he did not know this. Some of his bottom 5, context, competition, discipline is his worst. So
interesting.
Now he's doing really well right now, but it's helpful for me who oversee him. This is his area of weakness. I need to make sure, okay, his discipline is way not there. How are we going to work around that so his lack of discipline doesn't cause him to get a flat tire and just go off the side of the cliff? So how have you seen people who have, let's do it this way, understood their weaknesses and almost used it to be an advantage or done really well because, they understand what their weaknesses are?
Yeah, well, the first comment I would make about StrengthsFinder too to keep in mind is that the range is not definitive, right? So the one thing to keep in mind is just because someone has a strength doesn't mean that they're one of the best in the world at that thing, and just because they have a weakness doesn't mean they're one of the worst in the world at that thing, right? So it could be that they're I think for most people, my guess is the range between 1 and 34 is not, debilitating, right? So just because discipline your last one doesn't mean that you're, going out and drinking every night.
Oh, absolutely.
Have zero discipline in your life, right? Zero commitments and zero structure, zero, so I think that they're more, anyhow, so that's one thing, I think just a general comment. But I think, the smartest leaders I have worked with in terms of their weaknesses, they tend to, well, first of all, the organization tends to reflect the leader. Right. So a leader's weaknesses definitely come out in an organization's weaknesses. So whether it's communication, being a good team player, being able to communicate a vision, the organization then struggles with the inability to have vision. I think of typically, actually, as a consultant, I tend, because I'm one of my strengths is, I don't think this is on the list, but I tend to be fairly malleable in terms of the role I can play. That's just part of who I am. I tend to get brought in to fill in those gaps. So I think I'm analytical. I think you're covering a ranger there. There's a couple.
Yeah, a ranger's one.
Yeah, analytical as well. So the ability to come in and sort of assess and help move an organization. So typically when someone brings me in, it's basically to figure out what the weaknesses is and how I can help with that. So that's a big part of it. But typically leaders will install people and processes and solutions around not only their weaknesses, but if they're having a hard time with self-realization, they'll at least stick them around the organization's weaknesses, right? And so that in many organizations, I've been asked to sort of play a generic chief of staff role, an advisor role, or business development role, because those tend to focus on areas that are enhancing the business in terms of taking it towards the future, bridging the gap between vision and execution. And so, again, it's sort of, I'm not giving very specific examples, but I've worked with several clients who are looking for ways to try to overcome their weaknesses simply by understanding their organization's weaknesses and applying resources to those. And usually the output then at least is the ability to assess and apply very specific, whether it's technology or technical deficiencies, bringing people who are devs and engineers or analysts or designers or website builders or whatever the solution needs to be. That tends to be then where I help leaders see what they need and how we go about trying to address that. And then that tends to reflect, again, organization's weaknesses reflect the leader's weaknesses every single time. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
I've heard this before, and I wish I had a citation for this, but before StrengthsFinder came out, I heard that the author was considering calling it a talent finder. And they changed it because they figured it would sell better, and that was true. But think of it in terms of talent. What are your talents? What are you naturally good at? Now, it doesn't mean you're good at them. We will see some people, they are naturally gifted in an area. And I think this is what you alluded to. You still have to develop that talent.
Oh, sure.
And this is where, some people are just, if you're 7 feet tall, you're going to naturally be have a higher potential at basketball than if you're 5'1". It's naturally that as a talent or basically a feat of genetics. And it's the same thing with StrengthsFinder. And I think understanding just because someone shows the ability, they also have to want to go in that general direction too. They have to hone their skills. They have to get really good. What does it look like to be really good at empathy or harmony or focus? I'm just listening on different things on StrengthsFinder. Some people are naturally good at it, but you can still get better at empathy or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, well, and I think it's also, I think, goes to understanding not only what you're really good at, but again, back to just recognizing other people aren't good at those things. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, I work with a lot of CEOs who struggle to understand why people can't seem to figure out their vision, why there's this disconnect between vision and execution, why there's communication problems internally, why there's cultural problems internally. And I was telling them, sorry, but it's your fault.
Yeah.
You're the CEO. I mean, this is your problem. You're the entrepreneur. This is your problem. There's a reason why CEOs and entrepreneurs get the lion's share of the equity and the rewards is because they have both the upside and the downside. It's just part of the gig. And helping them see that to be in the role that they're in, either an entrepreneur or a CEO, it usually requires very different strengths than the people they then need around them to execute. And sometimes that also then creates friction with those people because they're very different personalities, right? You don't go hire, 5 more entrepreneurs necessarily who want to build their own companies. You got to find people who are entrepreneurial who want to build a company with you, right?
Absolutely.
So
and if you look at StrengthsFinder, you can take all 34 of the strengths that are out there, and they break them down into 4 categories. The 4 categories that all 34 go into it is either executing, influencing, relationship building, or strategic thinking. So if you have a whole bunch of strategic thinkers and no executors, you're going to spend all day in the library and not get anything done.
Right. And likewise, the executors get really annoyed with the strategic thinkers, right? Because they're like, come back to earth, please, right? And so there's a natural friction. And so I think part of what you're trying to put together as you think about teams, right, in these areas is how do you get a diverse team but not just annoy the heck out of each other because you all are so different, right? Because I mean, it's so funny how oftentimes, I fly between the visionaries and the executors, and they're like, I can't figure out what such and such is thinking, right? And they're pointing the finger at each other, right, in these sessions that I have, and it's pretty funny.
I've seen it happen many a times, and I've gotten really, really frustrated as well, too.
Sure.
My own personal coach is like, well, yeah, Erik, you're getting really frustrated at so-and-so, but you need to also realize that so-and-so has prevented a lot of mistakes because they have spared you, because I'm fairly impulsive, but lots of the impulsive, no, not at all. But a lot of my impulsiveness has made us a lot of money because I've been able to grab onto some really good ideas and go with them. But likewise, I have enough strategic thinkers and people who can build relationships with me. I need them, because if not, I'm just going to go solo, and you can't scale all that much solo.
Right. No, and that's where I think it's interesting. one of mine is in Relator, which is relationship building, and that's where I've been able to be successful with a lot of the consulting work I've done, is because you're able to parachute into an organization where there's some sort of reason they're having you come in, there's some disconnect or some problem, and the ability to start from relationships as opposed to CEO mandate or SOW, which is never a good place to start.
Yeah, really.
Helps me at least to try to begin to put the pieces together on what both is and what could be, and therefore begin to build the bridges and the plans around which the organization can sort of move from wherever they are at point of chaos or point of just mediocrity to the next phase of growth.
And one thing I've noticed, to put a bow on this, in terms of strengths, I've noticed time and time again, people are happiest when they work in their area of strength.
Oh, yeah.
And because you're winning.
Yeah.
And people are like, I want to do this. You stink at that. Well, I still want to try it. I'm like, okay. People love to win. Now, it doesn't mean there's just one. There can be a lot of different areas of strengths. So this is where it's nice. Everyone should know what they're naturally gifted in, so we can maximize that.
Well, and the point I would make for our listeners, too, is you're trying to figure out how to get your... So I think what the risk of that is people rarely find all 5 strengths in one job.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So that's the thing to be aware of, is including the listeners, but also their teams. So if you're trying to basically try to build communities of people who are maximizing their strengths, there may not be a job that they're either in or could be in your organization that gives them all 5 strengths. So I think part of the plan is to also recognize that and help those individuals through HR benefits and other things, obviously relationships, better talent management, talent development solutions, help them find things outside work to put those things, to put them to use, right?
Yeah.
So whether it's working in a volunteer capacity, being on a board, volunteering as a coach, right, for a team, little league team or cross-country team or whatever,
well,
right?
Exactly
you're
right.
finding, you got to figure out what your strengths are, figure out how those map or don't map to your current job, and then figure out, assuming you don't want to leave your job, how you then can go get the other ones buckets filled, right? So that you feel more satisfied. That way you actually become more productive at your work if you're using those other strengths outside of work, so that you're not feeling deficient in your work stuff. So.
And it gets into having really healthy rhythms. What does that look like?
Yeah.
And that rolls into next week's episode. Hey, we've talked on seasons and rhythms before, but next week we're gonna, it's summer here, and we're gonna talk about summertime rhythms. What does a good summertime rhythm look like, both in the workplace and in family? And we can, just as we move into a different season, do we go on vacation for 3 straight months? Do we have to dial down even more work? What does that look like? And I think understanding our strengths, understanding our rhythms, it really makes for a healthy family and work-life balance.
Yep.
If it so exists.
Sounds good.
Well, good.
So next week we'll get after it.
Next week we'll get after it. And the week after that, this is going to be fun. How to get fired.
Yep.
But that's 2 weeks away.
2 weeks away.
Keep listening, and it's going to be a fun one.
How to get fired.
So, hey, in the meantime, check out our website, theconsultantandthecoach.com. I'll also put into the show notes the StrengthsFinder assessment. So if this is something you're like, hey, I wonder what my 34 are, where are my top 5, bottom 5, we'll have a link into the Gallup website so you can get that. And if you want to talk to us about it, reach out to us as well, too. We'd love to do that. So, hey, until next week, we look forward to talking to you.
Sounds good. Take care, everybody.